I think I'll just call the meeting to order, and may I ask everyone to come on in and close the door behind you. We have a really interesting speaker, and he's all prepared. I've even given him 4 questions to answer. So it's good to see you all, and I hope you have had a wonderful fall in your garden. And I'm going to have Susan over to introduce our speaker.
Thanks, Heather. Yeah, good evening, everyone, and welcome back to our second in-person meeting since the beginning of COVID. Yay! So I think we have about 29 people or 30 people here tonight, which is about the same as we had last month, and then we have a few more people online joining us, which I can see the numbers are climbing, so that's lovely. Last week, a week and a half ago actually, we were in Whistler, my husband and I, and Whistler Village has declared October Mushroom Month, and you can't go hiking there and go afoot in the woods without finding mushrooms. It's quite lovely. And I realized that according to Suzuki, it was David Suzuki, this is one of the regions that is pristine in the world still up there. One of the few left. And when you look at the ground and you realize how rich it is, you realize, yes, I get it. And yesterday I was at my community garden in Vancouver, and I found the most adorable little cluster of bird's nest mushrooms. And if you've never seen that, look it up. It's in Mr. Arevalo's book, and it's quite lovely. And they're not there? Okay, and in another book. Okay, it'll be in the field guide if you have it. Okay, and you know, this month, September, October's issue of Fine Gardening on page 53 has a whole sidebar on appreciating magical mushrooms. And they don't mean the kind that get you high, they mean the kind that are in your lawn. So it seems mushrooms are everywhere right now, and of course this is the time. This is the time you'll see them, September, October particularly. Willoughby Arevalo's passion for mycology has led him from mushroom identification and ecology to foraging and cuisine, do-it-yourself cultivation, farming, education, and even eco-arts. Originally from Arcata, California, Willoughby's 30-year friendship with fungi has taken him to communities throughout the US, Mexico, and Canada. He now lives in Vancouver, working part-time on an organic vegetable farm. In 2019, Willoughby's research and writing about mycology culminated with the creation and publication of his book, DIY Mushroom Cultivation, Growing Mushrooms at Home for Food, Medicine, and Soil. And it's published by New Society Publishers. And of course, copies are available for you out front and outside the sanctuary here at $30 a copy. You can also connect with the author through his website, mycelialconnections.net, and see his artwork at artworkandfungi.org. I'm sorry. Okay, art and fungi, right. Okay, sorry. And there's lots of other good things there too. I've had a look, and there's a cookbook with recipes and all kinds of things. So have a peek at that too. And tonight, we are delighted that our guest speaker and mycology expert is leading us through an introduction to mushrooms in our gardens and in the wild with his topic, Learning to Know Mushrooms. Will you please join me in welcoming Willoughby Arevalo?
Thank you, Susan. Thank you to everyone here for being present. And it's really nice to be in a gathering, in a space. I'm a member of the Vancouver Mycological Society also, and we have unfortunately not yet been able to resume our in-person meetings. So I'm glad for all of you that you're able to do this again. And I'm grateful to be here on the unceded, ancestral, and traditional territories of the Musqueam, the Hokaminam-speaking peoples, the Stolo, the Sawasan, and any others who have shared this territory since time immemorial. So I would like to share a welcoming for you all into my view a bit and my world of fungi. It's not really mine anyway, but a bit of my worldview through fungi. And along with that, I will share something about what mushrooms and fungi are and what they're doing in wild ecosystems as well as in gardens. And I will also talk about how we can learn to recognize them and get to know them because there are so many different kinds. And so we'll talk about form groups, recognizing their basic forms, and wrapping our heads around different ways that they're categorized and classified. And then we'll talk a bit about practices around harvesting mushrooms and interacting with them in safe and respectful ways. And I'll offer some examples of different types of mushrooms and talk about specific ones, and also give you some resources for further learning. So I imagine we're all gardeners here, is that correct? Everybody's a gardener? Fabulous. And that means that we have a relationship with land through our gardens and probably in other ways too. We are all nourished by the land, whether it's food that we grow ourselves in our own gardens or even food that is grown far away in distant lands and produced in factories and then shipped across the ocean and packaging and then purchased in grocery stores. Even that is the land nourishing us. And we also, as humans, have a responsibility to care for the land. As gardeners, we all do that. And I find, for me, a big part of my relationship with mushrooms over the course of my life, because I started at a very young age engaging with mushrooms, a big part of my process has been learning ways to care for them, to give back, and to support them. Oh, look, I have this little machine. Huh? Oh. Okay, so as Susan mentioned, this is my book. You probably checked it out. If not, that's fine. It is not so much about fungi in the wilds, but it's more about fungi in our homes and in our gardens and in our other more intimate spaces. And so yeah, I also wanted to just acknowledge that my friend Carmen Elizabeth did some beautiful illustrations, watercolors, and line drawings for it. And you'll see some of those in this presentation. Next slide, please. Okay. So I wrote this book over a couple years, and it's been out for now a couple years. And it was definitely a shift for me to go into mushroom cultivation from most of my life has just been about being interested in wild mushrooms. And in my 20s was when I started being interested in mushroom cultivation. And I learned initially by working at a mushroom farm and working in a lab, helping to inoculate the fruiting substrates with the spawn. And from there, I learned to transform that into home-scale, lower tech techniques that were more accessible, and that's what the book is about. So, when I think about fungal biology, I think about how they live their lives, their living processes, just as we animals are always transforming, our bodies exchange all our cells except our brain cells every 7 years. Did you know you're only 7 years old except for your brain? And so fungi and animals and plants, we're all living processes. We're not things, but we're processes. And that's how I like to view it. And fungi, like us, and like all living beings actually, are quite sensitive. They have many senses. Often it's said that we have 5 senses, we humans, but others will argue that we have 23 or potentially more senses than that. If you get very specific, you can be more specific than just touch. We can feel pressure, we can feel texture, we can feel temperature, and many other nuances to what it is to touch something. And I also really like to think about fungi as active agents in their ecosystems and in their worlds. And so I like to really pay a lot of attention to what they're doing. Next slide, please. So a mushroom, first of all, is what we are most familiar with when we think of fungi, probably. Maybe we think of molds, maybe we think of yeast, especially if you're a baker or a brewer. You may think of the fungi living in your compost pile, or the fungi supporting the roots of your plants in getting their minerals and water that they need. But oftentimes we think of these big fleshy things that pop up when it rains. And the mushroom is really a fruiting body. It is there to produce and disperse spores, which are the sexual reproductive cells of the fungi. And so, it jumped. Did you switch slides, or was that, huh? That was you? Oh, I'm not quite ready yet. I was using the pointer. Thanks, though. So we see here a kind of exquisite corpse or exquisite basidio corpse of a mushroom, an imaginary mushroom with many different features. So when we want to learn how to recognize mushrooms, we need to learn first all the different body parts that they may have, and then the nuances of all the details of how those body parts can be expressed. Just how we could have different colors of eyes. Some of us have curly hair, others have straight hair. Some people are bald. You know, all of these types of qualities, we all, it's all hair, but it expresses itself differently. And so the cap of a mushroom will have different surface textures, different colors, etc. And that can be visible with the naked eye. We could also go into even more detail with the microscope if we were so inclined. But essentially, what we see when we see a mushroom is really just a sexual organ. And the rest of the fungus, next slide please, is underground in the soil or in wood or in other organic matter, sometimes in living trees, sometimes infecting animals as well, like that one between my toes that makes my left foot itch. This is the true body of the fungus that lives over time and is doing most of the daily life's work of being a fungus. And that includes a lot of life processes, just like we are busy bodies doing all sorts of things, even most of them we're not consciously thinking of, things like breathing and eating and digesting and circulating blood. Well, fungi do a lot of similar actions as well through this network of thread-like cells that we call mycelium. A single one of those threads is called the hypha, or hyphae plural, and together the whole mass of hyphae makes what we call a mycelium, which looks something like this. Has anybody ever turned over a rotten log or picked up some rotting leaves in their garden or compost pile and seen something that looks kind of like this? It can express itself in various ways, but each thread is basically microscopic. Occasionally, in just the right light, we can barely see it, like as thin as a spider web or something. But it's usually only in mass, when there's a lot of it in a small area, that we can really see it clearly with our naked eyes. And it's all through all healthy soil. In a single teaspoon of healthy soil, there should be about 1 kilometer of threads. And if you're standing on healthy ground, under each one of your feet will be about 300 miles of mycelium, if we were to line it all up end to end. It's pretty mind-boggling, actually. And so this network grows from the tips, branching as it goes. And when it touches back to itself, those cells fuse together, creating a very complex network of many pathways within the system. And throughout these tube-like cells, organelles, nutrients, cell fluids, and electrical signals are constantly in motion in multiple directions. So even within a single tube, an unbranched section, there's bidirectional movement. And so it's a very busy place, a busy body, if you will. And each tip has its own sensory world. Could we have the next slide, please? Oh, maybe it's not there. Or maybe it's the one after. Yes, we'll come back to that one. So fungi, if we could imagine a cartoon version of a hypha, it might be something like this. Well, certainly they don't have little miniature noses, eyes, and mouths all over their cells, but they actually have sensory receptor molecules all over themselves that behave similar to those that we have in our bodies for making our senses work. So fungi are extremely sensitive to chemistry and are able to smell and taste with a great level of nuance and detail. And they also sense light. And some fungi can have up to 11 different types of photoreceptors on their cells. And we have, is it 2 or 3 in our eyes? I'm not sure. But there's rods and cones, and I think there might be 2 kinds of one or the other. But either way, they can probably see colors that we could only imagine. And certainly they don't see in pictures because they don't have lenses like our eyeballs to focus the world into sharp pictures. But they are certainly sensing and responding to light. So each tip is growing and making its own decisions. Previous slide, please. And part of this growth and this decision-making and this moving towards what is desirable is finding a mate. Because each spore, like a sperm and an egg, is only a half set of genes, rather than a fertilized seed, which has a whole new generation packed up inside it, ready to grow roots and leaves. A spore can grow hyphae, but it can't make new mushrooms from those until that primary haploid mycelium finds a compatible, suitable mate. So someone of the same species, but also of compatible mating type. We have mating types in our species. We call them male and female. Theirs aren't shaped differently or having higher or lower pitched voices or anything like that. But they also don't have 2. They have, well, some species have 2, like the common button mushroom that grows in grocery stores, is purchased in grocery stores. That one only has 2, but that's a relatively rare case. Most of them have more, and some have thousands of different mating types. And what this essentially does is makes them compatible with more of their peers, making them have an easier time to find a suitable mate with whom they can produce mushrooms and the next generation of spores. So as we go around this wheel from the top, from 12 o'clock there, we see the spores growing out into threads and then finding each other, which they do through pheromone communication, sending pheromones and receiving pheromones and growing towards the origin of the pheromones that smell attractive. Have you ever been attracted to somebody because of their smell? fungi do the same thing. Then if they do indeed find a compatible mate, they fuse together. And then when the time is right, when the season is giving them the right environmental conditions, such as humidity and temperature, as well as enough food, enough energy stored up to be able to put a lot of energy into growing mushrooms, because let's face it, this is a big energy expense for a being that is normally one cell thick. And sure, it may take up a large amount of space and have access to many nutrients, but this is a complex structure compared to mycelium. This is actually fully made of mycelium as well, though. It's just differentiated into different types of structures. More, I like to think of mycelium as kind of white noise, and then a mushroom being like a symphony. Highly organized. Next slide, please, and one more. So fungi, like I said, have to eat. They have to get energy. And the way they do that is not too different from us. Most of them get their energy from plants. We get most of our energy from plants. All of it, if you take animals as plant eaters, which they are, at least most of the ones that we eat. And so there's different approaches that fungi have to getting their energy from plants, or sometimes from other fungi, or from animals. And these translate into the types of relationships or ecological roles that they have with plants. So the ones toward the bottom right mostly eat dead plants, and that's their food. And as cultivators, those are the ones that we're able to grow relatively easily, because it's slightly more complicated than this, but we can basically chop up and cook some dead plants and feed it to them, and then put them in the right environmental conditions for them to create mushrooms, and hopefully they do. But some mushrooms don't exactly wait for their host to die. Some of them thrive on living hosts. Mushrooms like honey mushrooms. Has anybody encountered these in their garden or orchard? They grow clustered at the base of trees or from roots, and they produce these long, thick cords of mycelium that look kind of like bootlaces. And they can girdle and kill trees. And they can also take up huge, vast areas. One of the largest known organisms on the whole planet is one in eastern Oregon that takes up about 10 square kilometers and is estimated to be 8,000 years old. Now, if we think about the thought processes going on amongst these trillions of hyphal tips in that vast network, it's mind-boggling to consider all the different thought processes and ideas and learning and memory that giant old fungus has. Scientific studies have shown that mycelium does have memory and is capable of learning. So the mushrooms up around the top are mushrooms that associate in a symbiotic, mutualist relationship with trees or other plants. So mushrooms like the matsutake, also called pine mushroom, or lacaria, and even morels, they associate with trees. Their mycelium wraps around the roots and penetrates into the root tips of plants, and it extends beyond the roots, vastly expanding the functional root system of the plants. And because they're much finer, much finer than even the finest root hairs, they're able to have a much greater access to water and mineral nutrients. And they have a whole array of chemical tools that they produce to access mineral nutrients, such as phosphorus. Mycorrhizal fungi, myco meaning fungus, rhiza meaning root, this association and these fungi that associate with plants are often responsible for gathering the majority or even sometimes all of the phosphorus that a plant has and uses and delivering it directly into the roots. Most plants in the whole world have some sort of fungus associating with them in this way, or usually multiple different types at once. There are only a few plant families that don't have this type of association, and their ancestors did. They've just evolved out of it. They found other strategies. Interestingly, as gardeners, some of those plant families are some of our most common crops, such as those in the mustard family, the brassicas, and also the chenopods, the spinach family. Interesting, I think. And these are, in nature, very weedy species, those that tend to settle in very disturbed, often nutrient-poor ground. If you think about where you see wild mustards and wild lamb's quarters and those types of plants, it's often gravelly, very mineral-rich, but low in organic matter types of soils. They're often some of the very first plants to start to grow there. So often scientists like to put things in boxes, but there are many examples of mushrooms that blur the lines between these different categories of decomposer, parasite, and mutualist. And some can switch over the course of their lifespan, depending on the situation and relationships they find themselves in. For example, morels, the fire morels, will be mycorrhizal for many years, living in relationship in a trading, gifting relationship with their tree partners. And then when a forest fire comes and kills the trees in the forest, they switch over to a decomposer role and sporulate like mad. They create lots and lots of mushrooms and sporulate to move to the next forest or to inoculate the new seedlings that will regenerate after that fire. And so that is an example of a dual strategy. Sometimes they can also simultaneously be parasitic on grasses and other herbaceous plants. Some fungi are also parasites on other fungi, and this is actually quite common. So that hideous Gomphidius that we see up in the top corner is a parasite of a slippery jack or swillus mushroom, a type of bolete, which lives in a mycorrhizal symbiosis with conifer trees. So you'll always find the Gomphidius under conifers, but it's not because they're hanging out with the conifers. It's because there's an intermediate mushroom that they are taking from. Now, we don't really fully understand the nature of this relationship. Maybe they like each other in some way. Maybe they're friends. Maybe the swillus is more of a caretaker of the Gomphidius. We can look at it that way if we would like to. Next slide, please. So when we are learning to see mushrooms and get to know mushrooms and recognize mushrooms, some of the most important factors that we need to consider, not only what their form is and what they look like, feel like, and smell like, but also what their relationships are with the plants and the soil around them. What type of soil are they growing on if they're growing on soil? Are they emerging from the mineral layer or up in the duff layer? Are they growing from wood? And if so, what type and in what state of decay? And we can read into other relationships as well. So if you're really interested in learning how to recognize and identify mushrooms, we really have to learn tree identification as well, which is actually much easier than learning mushroom identification because there are far fewer tree species around here, for one, and the features might be a bit more obvious, I think. Next, please. So a bit about the naming and classification of mushrooms under the Western scientific taxonomic system. You're probably, as gardeners, used to some scientific names, even if you don't think about them that way. Rhododendron, asparagus, astilbe, many different plants that we grow are called in our common language by their scientific name or a part of their scientific name. So the most broad categories being at the top, well, actually with the common name being above those. And then going down more and more specific as we get to the bottom. Next slide, please. So mushrooms show a lot of examples of strange evolutionary twists to all these evolutionary stories. These two mushrooms look pretty similar, right? To most people, these would look like they could be related to each other, having common ancestry not too far back in the evolutionary story. But actually, the one on the right, their ancestor is a bolete mushroom, one with a spongy tube layer under the cap. These two mushrooms are very, very distantly related. Next slide, please. These two mushrooms look pretty different, right? But they are very closely related. They have only a very short time since their most recent common ancestor, relatively speaking. The one on the left has switched strategies from being a guild mushroom and shooting spores into the air and gone underground and started living a truffle lifestyle, attracting animals with smells, alluring odors to come dig them up, eat them, and poop them out somewhere else, thereby spreading the spores. These two mushrooms smell the same. They have the same colors. But other than that, they are quite different in form and appearance. Interesting. Next slide, please. So this is those honey mushrooms or armillaria that I was talking about, which most likely they might be present in your garden even if you don't see the mushrooms. The mycelium of this fungus can also eat everything from dimensional lumber to the roots of perennials such as raspberries, rhubarb, comfrey, you name it, as well as many shrubs, but even herbaceous and cane plants and different types of plants. But they're mainly going after trees, and they certainly can be problematic in orchards where they can kill or decrease the health of fruit trees and such. But also, this is an example of how, over time, the naming and classification of mushrooms has changed. So, some number of decades ago, these all would have been called Armillaria mellia. But now, due to the analysis of the molecules of DNA taking the forefront of how organisms are named and classified, we have all these new names, and it's been realized or decided by the taxonomists that there are 12 different species of honey mushrooms in North America alone, and even more worldwide. So this is often confusing and frustrating and tiring to a beginner or amateur mushroom person, and probably most mushroom people except the taxonomists who make a living making new mushroom names and describing new species. But to me, I just call them all Armillaria by their genus name, and that's good enough for me. Next slide, please. So I'd like to share another resource with you. And if you could switch over to the PDF there, Ryan. This is a fabulous new identification resource that came out a couple years ago. Oh, could you go to the first page of it? Would that work? Thank you. These two fellows from Denmark put out this 2-book set, weighs 12 pounds and cost me $200. But for me, it was worth every penny. Probably not for any of you. Incredible photographs and a really innovative identification key system where they use this wheel format with the broadest categories in the middle and more specific groupings as you move out. And then at the bottom here, oops, did I just do that? Oh, I can have my own control. That's nice. There's this little wedge here that says other similar fungi. So that would lead you to other keys, other different wheels. And so these are the books. But what's fabulous is that they have, even though they've made these very high-level books that are a bit spendy, they also gave away all of these wheels for free digitally. So if you go to mycokey.com, you can download this document that I'm about to share with you and use it. And even though it's designed for Europe, there's enough similarity and enough species that are present in both places that it is absolutely very useful. So I'll probably be popping through this page more than once, maybe not. Oops. So this is the big picture of all the different form groups of mushrooms. And if you'll follow my little red laser dot here, starting here, these are all mushrooms that disperse their spores through the air and usually shoot the spores into the air actively. On the next page, we'll see ones that make their spores on the inside, but all of these have their spores borne externally on their fruiting bodies. And most of these are basidiomycetes, which is one whole phylum of fungi, like phylum Chordata. All of the animals with spines are a phylum together. So whether you're a fish or a human or a rhinoceros or a turtle, you're all in the same phylum. So we can see quite a diversity within this phylum. And then the other phylum of mushroom-producing fungi are the ascomycetes, which are super diverse, and they also include many of the familiar molds and yeasts, including the mold on your brie and the yeast in your bread. And so we get these big forms here, these big groupings, nice line drawings to give you a kind of clear picture, and then some more detailed, beautiful photographs. So most people will be familiar with the chanterelles, some of the most beginner-friendly and accessible wild edible mushrooms that are often even available in good grocery stores during the season. The gilled mushrooms, or agarics, this is the largest group. Here in BC, we have about 3,000 known mushroom species. There are undoubtedly more that have yet to be named, described, or found here. And most of them are this type, the ones with gills or blades on the underside of the cap. There are the boletes, fleshy mushrooms with a cap and a stalk and a fleshy tube layer, or a spongy tube layer, under the cap. Polypores, which may be tough, and they have pores or tubes on the underside as well, but they're firmly attached, and usually they're a tougher, leathery or hard, woody, corky type of texture. The tooth fungi, the crust fungi, the rosettes and other strange ones, the corals and clubs, and then a bunch of little ones that we'll skip over. The jelly fungi, which are really fun textural weirdos, and a bunch of plant pathogens, including rusts and smuts. You might be familiar with some rusts from your garden, common on roses and apples and Saskatoon berries. Those actually all being the same rust that affects all of those plants because they're all in the rose family. You may have seen rust as the form of swollen branches on blueberry and huckleberry bushes. That's another one that has fir trees as an alternate host. And then there's also the ascomycete fungi, such as the cup fungi. Oops, I did it twice. So these are all the ones that make their spores on the inside. And most of these we're not going to talk hardly at all about, if at all. But there are the bumpy bumps, I like to call them, the ones who make their spores in little pimples, if you will. Some of these are plant parasites, some of them are decomposers, some of them are insect parasites also, which are quite interesting. Is anybody familiar with at least a concept of these insect parasite fungi, like the zombie ant fungus, for example? Yeah, they're really interesting. And we have some species around here, which if you're lucky, you can see them. A bunch of little ones up here I'm not going to talk about. The puffballs, probably quite familiar to almost everybody. Those make their spores in a mass on the inside and then puff them out at maturity. The earth stars, which are just very fancy puffballs with some decoration. The bird's nest fungi, which splash their spores out in little packets from perfectly formed cups. And the stinkhorns. Anybody ever have stinkhorns in their garden? No, none of us are so lucky. They're incredibly interesting fungi that are quite off-putting to many people because of their foul smells and sometimes suggestive forms. And then there are the truffles, which grow underground and disperse their spores with the help of animals, some of which are quite delightful edibles, but most of which are not unless you are a squirrel. The chanterelles, really good group to know. What's special about them is they've got these wrinkly veins on the underside instead of true blades like true gills. And the most common mushroom, probably the most common edible wild mushroom around our bioregion here in the kind of coastal rainforest, temperate rainforest, is the Pacific golden chanterelle. And are some folks familiar with those chanterelles? Yeah, they're quite tasty. They have a fruity flavor and aroma and are very common in association with hemlocks, Douglas firs, and Sitka spruce, among others. Then there are all these gilled mushrooms. Now this could get overwhelming, so I'll try not to make it so. But there's many different types, and we'll dig into some of them and skip over a bunch of them. You'll see here in the middle, there's the first kind of division is based on the color of their spores. The light-colored spores, white to cream, the yellow, white to yellow, and then other spore colors get a whole other wheel. These are those with the dark spores, brown spores, yellow spores, green spores, there's only a couple kinds, and pink to brownish rose spores here. Making a spore print is often a very crucial identification step. So what we do is we take a mature mushroom, remove the stalk, set it down on a piece of paper. Usually we use white paper. And then we cover it up with a bowl or something. Hat could work. And we let it sit for 12 hours or so, during which time the spores will shoot off from the gills and fall down onto the paper. And then we'll get this beautiful pattern, like you can see, like you can see some here. So before we dig into this, I'd just like to check on time. So how much more time? About 15, okay. So we'll breeze through these. We're looking at the different form groups here. So these mushrooms aren't necessarily related to each other, but they all share the lack of a stem or an off-center stem, and usually fruiting off of vertical surfaces out to the side. The most familiar of these likely will be, the oyster mushrooms, which we see over here. Anybody seen oyster mushrooms before? Perhaps in the grocery store at least, maybe on dead alder trees or cottonwoods or others. Very common, often beginner-friendly edible mushrooms. And then these are the clitosoboids. Oid just means resembling. So clitosoby is a genus of mushrooms, which used to be quite large and containing most of these types, now only containing a few species. But these all have gills that run down the stalk, either a little bit or quite a bit. And they all have pale white or close to white colored spores. Some of them are edible, some of them are not. It's a big group. The waxy caps. You may have seen some very brightly colored mushrooms in the woods that look like they're made of glass. They could be, especially like these ones up top and center, they can be really brightly colored. And if you touch and look at the gills, they have an appearance like wax. They feel like wax between the fingers. And that is characterizing this whole group. These ones are mostly plant associated, some of them with trees and others with grasses, living in symbiosis with grasses and other herbaceous plants. The mycenas and similar mushrooms. So mycena are all of these ones down here, and most of these other ones were in the genus Mycena until recently. Small, delicate mushrooms. I'm sure you've seen mushrooms that look like this. Even this week, you've probably seen them. They're often, the caps are no larger than a pea. Some of them can be toonie-sized or larger, but mostly they're dime-sized or smaller. And they're quite cute. Children love finding them and pointing them out. They are mildly toxic. I mean, the toxin in them is a significant one, but they are so tiny that it would probably take a lot of them to cause a poisoning. And they're almost all decomposers. So eating dead plants through the use of enzymes and acids and physical pressure to break down their food and suck in the nutrients they want. And all of the decomposer fungi essentially are soil builders. As gardeners, we can see these decomposers as our friends because they are turning dead plants into new soil. And then the tricholomatoids is a big messy group of white-spored mushrooms. Most of them not worth too much of our time in this moment. There are some gorgeous and interesting mushrooms among them, certainly. Quite a few, actually. The most interesting and significant for us in this area, I think, is the matsutake or pine mushroom. Has anybody ever smelled a matsutake or pine mushroom? A couple of folks. They have a very, very alluring but perhaps challenging aroma, classically described by David Aurora, the author of this book, as a provocative compromise between red hots and dirty gym socks. Highly prized in Japan, and many of the commercial mushroom pickers in this area are picking matsutake to export to Japan. And Japan eats most of the matsutake that are picked in the whole world. The colibioids is another group of small, pale-colored mushrooms, usually pale-colored with a white spore print, and also mostly decomposers, soil builders. And same with the marasmioids. These ones have tougher stems. Sometimes you'll find, I saw one today that was incredibly cute. The whole mushroom was about 1.5 inches tall. The stalk looked like a hair out of my mustache, and the cap was smaller than a pea and had a little collar around the stem. It's quite lovely. Lepiotoid mushrooms are interesting and good for gardeners to know. There are there's one species that is extremely common in the late summer to early fall called the smooth parasol, or the lady on a motorcycle. They look an awful lot like these, except they're white. They're kind of white everywhere, sometimes a dingy, dirty white. Sometimes the gills are a bit pinkish at maturity. And likely you've seen them growing in lawns and disturbed areas near roads and also in gardens. And they are, I think it's this one right here, probably, or something similar to that anyway. And they're quite abundant and common. Tempting as an edible for some, and some people do eat them. Some people have experienced unpleasant effects. Most people are able to eat them without problems. However, there are poisonous lookalikes, so they are generally not recommended. Also, like many mushrooms, they uptake and hyperaccumulate heavy metals from the soil. Heavy metals such as lead, cadmium, mercury, arsenic are often drawn up into the mushrooms from the soil through the mycelium, transported through those tube-like cells into the mushrooms. It's kind of a mystery as to why they do this. Perhaps they're trying to package that heavy metal in a tidy container that can then be carried off by some unwitting mammal or other larger animal. Maybe it's a disposal strategy, I don't know. But we also have some very poisonous ones. There's some of these kind of looking ones, and these. There's this one you may have seen in potted plants before. Bright yellow, kind of powdery looking mushroom. Has anybody ever had this one? It's called the flower pot parasol. It's extremely brightly yellow, and it practically only grows in potted plants. A unique ecological niche that hasn't been around very long. Certainly the mushroom species must have been around longer than potted plants, but it was probably much less common before we had potting soil, and it's probably a tropical species anyway. Amanita. Probably everybody has seen one of these in the last few weeks, right? Amanita muscaria, the fly agaric, the classic quintessential toadstool or mushroom, the red to orange or even yellow or white cap with the white or yellowish warts on the cap and a scaly bulb at the base, and when mature, a beautiful skirt on the stalk. These mushrooms have captured the imagination of humans, and they've found their ways into many elements of our popular culture and our folk tales and our literature. And there are some pretty convincing arguments that this mushroom has a lot to do with the Santa Claus story. Well, we all know that Santa Claus lives at the North Pole, right? Well, these mushrooms actually live quite far north as well. And some indigenous peoples from the very far north, including the Sami of present-day Finland and the Koryak from eastern Siberia, both reindeer herding peoples, both have a history of rituals using this mushroom as an inebriant, as a drug, or as a medicine, depending on how you want to look at it, for ceremonial purposes around the winter solstice. Reindeer love this mushroom. It's one of their favorite foods, and they will gobble it up whenever they get the chance. And I'm pretty sure that's how Santa's reindeer learned to fly. The green mushroom just beside the fly agaric, The fly agaric, by the way, certainly is poisonous in addition to having some mind-altering properties. It can also make you feel very sick at the same time as feeling like you're in another world. And it's a matter of how it is prepared and processed. Some people actually even process it in a way to detoxify it, because the specific compounds in that mushroom are water soluble. So they can, and in some cultures, are cooked out through several changes of boiling water, and then the mushrooms are eaten as food. However, the mushroom just beside, and that mushroom is poisonous but not deadly. The mushroom just beside it, this green capped one, does anybody recognize that mushroom? It's in the news a lot this time of year. Any guesses? Huh? It is not hallucinogenic. The red one is, but the green one is not. Has anybody heard of the death cap? Yes, it's all over the news this time of year for good reason, because it is very common here. Not in the forests around here, but in our towns and cities. Because this tree, or this mushroom rather, came from Europe on the roots of non-native trees. European trees brought to this continent to be planted because they're nice trees. Their fungal partners came with them, attached to their roots, and now live here as well. So these mushrooms have been on this continent for a couple hundred years or so, on this coast of this continent for almost 100 years, and in BC for just over 20 years, as far as we understand. And they are becoming more and more common. I have some growing in my front yard as we speak. I live in East Vancouver, and they're growing under hornbeam trees mostly, but also they grow in association with both sweet chestnuts and horse chestnuts, a variety of types of oaks. They'll grow with beech, they'll grow with European birch, and they'll also grow with Garry oak, our native oak from the islands, and they have indeed naturalized into the Garry oak ecosystem. Whether or not they're displacing native mycorrhizal fungi is unknown, but they are beneficial to their tree partners. So, you know, the trees in front, that hornbeam tree that the city planted some number of decades ago in front of my house is all the healthier for the presence of this mushroom. And it's just important that we don't eat it. That's all. Another thing is that it is actually safe to handle these mushrooms. And I do so regularly this time of year when they're fruiting. There are numerous patches in my neighborhood, and I collect them. And I apologize, but I neglected to bring any tonight. I usually bring some around with me to show people so they can get to recognize the mushroom. But these mushrooms have some important features. I actually have another slide of them later. I can talk about those features later. Russula. You've probably seen russulas if you've walked in the woods in the fall ever, because these are some of the most common and abundant mycorrhizal tree-loving fungi out there. And they all have a kind of short, squat stature, and many of them are colorful on the caps, but some are certainly not. And they're all brittle in texture. Some are edible, some are not. And they have a sister genus. The milk caps are Lactarius. And as you can see, these photos of the gills in the middle show that when the gills are broken, or other parts of the mushroom too, but especially the gills, they release a liquid that is called milk or latex. And it can be variously colored. And these mushrooms, like their sister genus Russula, have toxic and edible species among them. Is anybody here of Russian ancestry? We've got one, at least. I don't know if you have heard of this, but in Russia there is a tradition of picking these mushrooms, and even the toxic species are all cooked and prepared together in a special preparation that is actually able to detoxify them. through soaking in water and boiling and then salting and essentially fermenting in thick layers of salt for 20 to 30 days. Then the mushrooms are soaked again to remove excess salt, and they are served typically with at least 1 shot of ice-cold vodka. And apparently they're quite good. I've never had the opportunity to sample these mushrooms prepared in this way. But it's interesting. So somebody had written down a question: is it possible to detoxify poisonous mushrooms through cooking processes? For most poisonous mushrooms, the answer is no. But for these mushrooms, yes, if you are Russian and know your traditions. I imagine people could also adopt those traditions and also be okay. But I think the vodka is an important ingredient. The entelomatoids are a big group that have pinkish spore prints. And we'll just skip those. Agaricus. This is another big one for gardeners. These ones here have come to join us. And we are all familiar with agaricus because they grow in grocery stores. I mean, mushroom farms. The white button mushroom, the cremini or brown button mushroom, and the portobello are all the same species. They're just like you would have different varieties and colors of tomatoes, you can have different colors of button mushrooms too. And actually, the brown ones, they get exposed to more light, and the white ones are kept in the dark. Some are pasty and pale, and some have a suntan. It's actually the case. Just like us, most mushrooms contain melanin and other pigments, and they're able to get darker when they have more sun exposure. And they also, like us, with that melanin, which protects us from UV radiation, also helps us to synthesize vitamin D. So if you eat mushrooms that have had sunlight exposure, or even some artificial light can, if it's the right wavelengths of light, can cause there to be good levels of vitamin D in mushrooms that is bioavailable to us if we eat them. So agaricus contains species that are obviously, some of them are edible, but some of them are also not edible. Especially these ones called the yellow stainers. These are quite common, and you'll see here that a lot of the staining reaction happens in the base of the stalk. And some of them have a very strong smell that's unpleasant, like phenol or carbol or ink. And those ones, if they smell nasty like that, you want to stay away from them. But, well, you don't have to stay away. We can hang out together. We can cuddle. I'm just not going to put you in my stomach. Okay? Thank you. You're cute. I like you. I just don't want to eat you. However, some species have different aromas. These ones at the top all have aromas similar to anise or almond extract. And these are some of the very most delicious of all edible mushrooms, especially this one here with the golden shaggy scales on the cap and a shaggy stalk below the skirt-like ring, large, stout size. These are called the prince, and they grow often under conifers, although I did see one under a horse chestnut the other day. They're decomposers, so they're not really specific about what types of trees they'll grow with, but they are leaf litter decomposers, soil decomposers, and quite delicious. The coprinoids is another familiar one, the inky caps for gardeners. Who's ever had some sort of inky mushroom in their garden that digests itself to a black goo? Well, the most common, or at least best known and biggest and showiest, are the shaggy manes. These can be quite large. And did anybody see the slide of Hillary's mystery mushroom from Prince George before this shit started? That was a shaggy mane, a young shaggy mane. I saw some today out of the window of my car in some landscaping. They're often in lawns and in gardens and in landscaped areas. And they are edible when young and white. And as you can see here, they digest themselves from the bottom up, turning themselves to ink to help disperse their spores, at which point they're not so edible, but can be used for writing letters, drawing pictures, etc. We are running short on time, so I'm going to skip over a bunch. I want to talk about boletes, those fleshy cap and stalk mushrooms with a spongy tube layer under the cap. They include a wide variety of different types of mushrooms, many of which are edible, a few of which are toxic, but around here, very, very few of them are toxic, and the toxic ones are uncommon. And the best known is the porcini, or king bolete, or steinpilz, or dubak, or pennybun, or cep, or it's got a bazillion other names in a bazillion other languages, because this is a very well-loved mushroom, especially to the Italians who call it porcini and proclaim it to be the best mushroom in the world, which arguably, maybe it is. They're super yummy. They grow in association with conifer trees around here, and occasionally hardwoods too. I actually saw some in the city today under hornbeam, just a couple blocks from one of my death cap patches. The polypores, these are mostly decomposers, but some of them are parasitic on living trees, and many of them are quite beautiful. A few of them are edible, such as chicken of the woods, which you see up here. I find it most on ornamental plum trees in neighborhoods, but they also grow on conifers in the forest. Some of them have stems, some are clustered, some are perennial and get larger and older each year. And some of them are more leathery in texture. And some of these are quite highly regarded for their medicinal properties. The complex polysaccharide molecules that make up the majority of their cell walls have an effect on our immune system that helps to balance it, both potentiating it, helping the production of our defensive cells without sending our immune system into overdrive, and can also actually simultaneously act as an anti-inflammatory while it's also helping us fight off disease and cancer. A lot of these are well studied and have long history of use as cancer medicines, including this mushroom called turkey tail, which is one of the most common mushrooms on this continent, and you've probably seen it on a rotting log with its kind of zoned caps that are leathery and a white underside. Going to skip through a bunch of these. Might actually, the tooth fungi. Dear me, I love the tooth fungi. I was graced with an incredible find this morning of a lion's mane, which is this big tuft of icicle-looking mushroom growing from a hole in a beech street tree in my neighborhood. And these are edible and choice, but also medicinal, with a chemical in them that stimulates nerve growth factor, one of the best natural medicines for stimulating nerve growth in our bodies. So it's being proposed for treating Alzheimer's and dementia, as well as other cognitive issues and nerve issues. And pretty exciting research going on there. Could we go back to the other slideshow, please? So here we are in the city of Delta, the township or village of Ladner, and we're also on unceded territory. And so I wanted to talk a bit about accessing land if you are interested in learning to gather your own mushrooms for food. If they're not growing in your own yard, then you've got to go somewhere where you're able to harvest them. And so we are not allowed to pick mushrooms in any park lands, no matter what designation of park it is. And we're not allowed to pick in indigenous reserves unless we have express permission. We're not allowed to pick on private land unless we have express permission, but often we may know people with forest in their private land and have access that way, and that's a great place to start. And then also you can go to crown land, which is where hunters and firewood harvesters and others go. And, but all of this land is indigenous territory, most of which was unceded. And so I think that it is important to acknowledge and recognize that, and also find ways to give back, not only to the land, but to the peoples who have stewarded it for many, many generations. So here again is that death cap. I want you to notice this, this veil, this cup of tissue at the base. It's most often underground. They also have a skirt on the stalk. The cap is greenish in color, starting rounded inside an egg-like membrane, and then bursting out and opening their caps. The chanterelle, this is our Pacific golden chanterelle here, the most common of the chanterelle species in our area, and a very great beginner-friendly edible wild mushroom. The first mushroom that my parents would let me cook at home, because they didn't know about mushrooms as much as I did, so they had to be able to trust me to make the right call. There's that beloved porcini or king bolete, a very meaty mushroom, 40% protein by dry weight, super savory, umami, nutty, and sweet, very satisfying mushroom. And there's that pine mushroom or matsutake. These are found with conifers and are definitely a treat to find and to eat. However, they do have a very poisonous look-alike called Smith's Amanita, which can be deadly, causing kidney failure if you eat enough of them. The smell, unlike matsutake, which is kind of spicy and musky, these have a kind of wet dog, hot tub kind of smell. And oyster mushrooms, I mentioned before, are another really good beginner edible, growing mostly in the month of May, but also some in the fall before it gets too cold. And different ways to grow mushrooms in your garden. You can do wood chip beds like we see here. This is a mushroom called the king stropharia or garden giant. Kind of hard to see right here in this picture, but there's a whole bunch of them here and here and along here. And you can also grow mushrooms on logs. Alder is one of our best available logs around here. And there's lots of sources now for getting spawn, what you would use as a starter for those. And you can put that in the logs, and eventually you get mushrooms growing out, and that's a nice thing. Mushrooms can be nice companions to garden plants as well, playing well with vegetables. There's that wine cap or garden giant again, and these are garden oysters growing alongside bean plants. So here are some more resources. My partner and I offer community arts projects in relation with fungi, artandfungi.org and walkingthemycelialweb.org to check out and participate in those two projects. There's also the Vancouver Mycological Society, and you can find us at vanmyco.com, normally meeting second Tuesday of each month at Van Dusen Botanical Garden. And lots more else out there, lots of good books. I especially wanted to promote this one, which just came out this fall. Perhaps you're familiar with the Plant ID book by Pojar and McKinnon called Plants of Coastal British Columbia. Well, Andy McKinnon also co-authored this one with Kem Luther, and it's quite good. It's got in-depth coverage of 350 local species, as well as a brief mention and coverage of 800 more species, as well as a bunch of interesting essays, really gorgeous, excellent photographs, and accessible, understandable language. So thank you all so much for showing up, and being excellent listeners. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them if I can. Oh, let's see if there's any here that I didn't address yet. Yes, describing a safe, non-destructive harvest method. There's long been a debate, do we pluck or do we cut? And so there's not a lot known about this, but some scientists did research around this with chanterelles specifically, and they found that it doesn't matter. And the patches will keep producing either way. Just as when you pick the berries off of your blueberry bush, it doesn't inhibit the bush from producing blueberries the following year. It's the same kind of thing. Mushrooms are essentially the fruit of the fungus. However, the largest impact that we do have as mushroom pickers in the forest is the compaction of the soil where the mycelium lives and the disturbance of the mycelium through our footsteps. Generally speaking, it's best not to take all the mushrooms because they need to disperse their spores, and also we aren't the only animals who like eating mushrooms. There are many other mushroom eaters out there, so it's good to share. And I can't really give any guidelines of it's okay to take half or a quarter or anything like that. You really have to get to know each type of mushroom, how common it is in your area, and how abundant they are, and those types of patterns. Another question, how do you destroy and dispose of poisonous mushrooms? Well, I don't usually. Personally, I like the poisonous mushrooms too, actually. I just don't like eating them. So I don't dispose of them through here. But if you are concerned about the safety of young children or eager puppies who don't know not to eat mushrooms, you can simply pick them and either put them in the compost. That's probably the best approach. Or with seriously poisonous mushrooms like death caps, you may want to put them in the garbage instead of in the compost because the toxins in those are quite stable, actually. But like I said before, it's safe to touch poisonous mushrooms with our hands. We have to actually ingest them for us to get poisoned. And for the most mushroom toxins out there, we can't remove the toxins by cooking them. Only a few types. There actually are quite a few mushrooms that are regarded as edible that are well loved, such as morels being a prime example, definitely poisonous raw. If you were to eat raw morels, you would get very sick. And it actually happened in a famous incident where the Vancouver police chief was retiring. This was a few decades ago. And the chef decided that he would serve for the banquet to celebrate his career, he would serve a salad with raw morels. Well, 88 people got sick that night. One person didn't because she gave hers to her husband. He ended up in the hospital. He was okay. They wouldn't kill you, but they would cause a very, very unpleasant night. So, are there any other questions? Which is what? Money's mushrooms. Yes. The farm. Yes. Yeah. So there's Money's mushrooms, I think, was the first mushroom farm in BC, or one of the first mushroom farms in BC. I don't know a lot of the specifics of their story, but I know that there is a surviving mural, or it was I guess more like a billboard or advertisement, but it still survives on Prior Street in Strathcona. There's an old painting on a wall What delicious morsels they be. Money's mushrooms. It's quite cute. Is there more to your question?
Just what kind is it?
It is Agaricus bisporus, or the button mushroom. Yeah, and they're cultivated by countless farms worldwide. The majority of them in the world are actually cultivated in China. China was the first country to cultivate mushrooms about 1,400 years ago. At least that's the earliest recording of mushroom cultivation. And those were the wood ear, which you may have had in Chinese cuisine before, or also called black fungus. They're chewy and rubbery and quite a nice texture, but not much flavor. And yeah, they're still kind of at the forefront of both the scale and also the techniques of mushroom cultivation.
Can you tell us a little bit about the turkey tail mushroom and its medicinal uses?
Yeah, so it is, Oh yes. Can I share about the medicinal properties of the turkey tail mushroom and a bit more about turkey tail? So first, a bit about recognizing it. It grows mostly on hardwood trees that are dead already, stumps and logs mostly. Around here, I see it lots and lots on alder, but sometimes on others. The underside is white with tiny little holes, and the upper surface is concentric zones of different colors that may be various browns, sometimes oranges, sometimes steely gray blues, and sometimes reddish browns and other colors. And they modulate the immune system to promote the creation of our defensive cells. And they also have compounds that directly attack the cancer cells and cause apoptosis, the programmed cell death that cancer cells lack, that other cells in our body have. And they also can act as a great adjunct therapy for chemo and radiation, reducing the negative side effects of those treatments and making those treatments less hard on our system. They're especially useful for breast cancer. There's been a lot of good clinical trials with that, and it's an extract from the mushroom has at times been the most prescribed cancer medication in Asia, but it is now not, because Taxol, which is actually, it was believed to come from the bark of the yew tree, but it actually comes from a microscopic fungus living inside of the bark of the yew tree that makes that amazing cancer medicine. Taxol is now #1, but before it was Crestin, which is a turkey tail extract.
One last question, please. If I wanted to grow mushrooms, do you buy them, or where would you buy them?
So you can start by taking a tissue sample of a mushroom and growing a culture and then growing spawn yourself. It's a more involved process, but if you wanted to simply add some mushrooms to your garden, you can buy what's called sawdust spawn, and it's a plastic bag filled with a sawdust-based medium that has the mycelium of the fungus grown all through it. And then you could either mix that in with wood chips and straw, or you could put it inside of logs, depending on what type of mushroom you want to grow and what sort of strategy. Some mushrooms are better in beds, some are better in logs, some could do both. There are a number of suppliers locally, and there's tons on the internet. One that I like to recommend is my friend's business, All the Mushrooms. It's allthemushrooms.com, and he's based in Powell River. And he's got a nice selection of varieties available, and he does good work, and he's a nice person. He contributed a lot of nice photographs to my book, so I always like to honor him by suggesting his business. But there's other ones around. I think there's one in South Vancouver called Shroom Stop. I don't think they have quite as big of a selection as he does, but they'd have enough to get you going. Yeah.
Wow. Willoughby, You're a fount of knowledge about mushrooms. And it's been really great. And I want to thank you for a very informative evening and presentation. And I think we've all taken quite a bit away. I feel a little overwhelmed with some of the information, but I'm going to parse it and from my notes. So thank you so much.
Yes.
And I'm sure we all enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you all. If you have more questions, you can just find me person to person after.
Yes, I guess, I was going to say, Willoughby,
If you have a few more minutes and want to stay around, we have about a 10-minute business meeting, Heather?
Sure.
And then we're going to do a draw, and it's usually based on the birth date
Oh, yes.
and of the speaker.
Yes.
So if you want to just have a seat, and then
Sure.
afterwards, if you have a few minutes, there may be people who are interested in talking to you afterwards.
Absolutely. And if you did buy a book of mine, thank you. And if you would like to have it signed, I'd be happy to do that if you're interested.
We did buy one book for the club, so in a future meeting, we'll give it away, okay?
Thanks.
Thank you all for waiting. There will be a draw after this. The first item of business. Oh, I'm sorry. Pardon me. It's been a while since I've been in this position, and I've completely forgotten everything. The first item is to ask if there are any questions about the Treasurer's report, which was sent out on the 15th by Darrell with information about this meeting and so on. If there are no questions, may we have a motion to approve the Treasurer's report? Okay, moved and seconded. Okay, Susan, and seconded by Gail. Thank you. G-A-L-E? G-A. Thank you. Coming up this Saturday, we're having a plant exchange. Setup is at 9:30, just out here in the parking lot. There'll be a canopy, if it's raining. Please bring a pot of plants, or 3 or 4 pots, or a dozen of your favorite plant that you like, and see if you can't convince someone else that they might like it too, and then you can trade, have fun. We're looking for people who might be interested in volunteering for positions in the coming year. Quite a few of us have already served our 2-year terms, and we'd like to, either if we stay one more year, we'd like to show someone else the ropes or turn matters over to them. In particular, Angelica, who you met at the door, but she's not here now, she wishes to retire from the newsletter. So if you have any desktop publishing experience or computer skills, or you just like writing letters about gardens and gardening experience, please make yourself known to Angelica or to me. I write articles in there too. And we'd love to have some other people that we could have write articles for us. Karen, you wrote a really nice article about your Larry the Larch tree. That was great. We also need a membership, someone to help with membership, especially if they have Excel skills. And show and share, we need someone to help Heather Fanta. I would like to step back from that. I've done it for about 4 years now. And tours, Heather Howie would like to, have someone to help her with tours. So all these people, if you could stand up, then the members might know who you are and feel more comfortable giving you a call and finding out about what's involved. It actually is quite fun. I've been on the executive for a good number of years now, and it's more fun than work. Okay. Elaine, would you like to move that we're going to, as notified in the notice on the... I'm sorry? Oh, about the bylaws. We're going to change the bylaws so that if you want to be a member for 2022, you have to pay your fees by the last day of February. Okay? As it stands now, the bylaws provide that you can pay your fees until March 31st. But that causes us problems with insurance and keeping tabs on who actually is a member and who isn't. So we'd like to amend the bylaws so that you have to pay your fees by the last day of February, and if you haven't paid by the 1st of March, you're not a member. Okay? You agreed to move the... We're not trying to exclude people, we're just trying to make our record keeping. Yeah. And Mary, would you like to second that? Okay, so that's that. And people who are at home, you can't vote now because we're live streaming. Would you please email me yes or no? Real easy answer, no trick question here, okay? Yes, we're going to change the bylaws, or no, we're not. And if you email me, we can take that into account when we're trying to settle how many people are interested in doing this. I'd like to bring your attention to the fact we're having the BC Council. I'm sorry? Oh, see what I mean? Yeah, you miss all this time off on Zoom and you fall to pieces. I guess we better call for a vote. All in favor of changing the bylaws? Okay, can I have someone count? 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12. Okay, I think all, yes. Yeah. Alrighty. And then we don't know how many are at home and who will send in the emails. Is there anyone against, opposed? I noticed there was no opposition. And abstaining? Nope. Okay. We're a pretty agreeable group here. Okay. And this is actually interesting. The BC Council of Garden Clubs, which looks after us all, is having their spring meeting, no, pardon me, their fall meeting this October, October 30th, in the morning from 9 until noon. And you can attend by Zoom. That's how they're doing it, by Zoom. They have some interesting speakers. I find the most interesting speakers are the students who use our scholarship donation. And they talk all about what particular research they're doing, everything from click beetles to the effect of glyphosate on roses in the north and things like that. And it's really fascinating how to plant a butterfly garden, all these things. So if you're interested, by all means, book off the time and get to your computer at 9 o'clock in the morning. Oh, and the big news is, because we're not having a Christmas party, November is Invite a Friend Month, okay? It's a Zoom meeting, and it's a subject. I'll get Susan to come and tell you all about the speaker, but it's a really interesting subject that if you want to invite a friend to come and see on her, or to look on her computer and see what kind of subjects we do, and it's not like having coffee and tea and the raffle and stuff, but it is a good way for people who are kind of curious, like, what do we do in this garden club anyway? They can sort of see what kind of subjects we talk about and how good our speakers are. And it's free. There's no guest or anything. It's just for November only. And Susan, if you'd like to come and tell people about what our speaker will be doing. Sure. And then we will have our spin the wheel. Well,
Okay, spin the wheel, right? Okay. Yes, so Stephanie Rose, who is very creative as a floral designer and in many other creative ways, is coming to do a bit of a demo and presentation for us in November via Zoom, as Heather said. So it should be lots of fun. She's going to be talking about creating, different designs for the holidays and special occasions. So I think it'll be an appropriate speaker for the time of year, and I think it's usually very enjoyable when we do these kinds of things. So, and it's a very popular event. So yes, do bring a guest to your Zoom screen and encourage them to join our club. I think renewal starts November or January? Are we starting renewal? It'll all be in the newsletter. Okay, as usual, read your news and bloom, and it'll all be there. But yes, we encourage you to come November. Stephanie Rose, as I said, very creative person, so and very crafty in all the positive ways. So I think she should be very entertaining. Okay? Thanks. Is that adjourn the meeting, or Laurie? Yes, Laurie. Go ahead, Laurie. I'm sorry, I didn't get that. Yes. Yes, I would think so. Right. Okay, just to summarize, you are welcome to have a guest join you on your Zoom screen at no cost. Normally we charge a $5 guest fee, but not this November. But do bear in mind that we have a maximum of 100 guests allowed, or 100 people allowed on our license. So, if you're passing the Zoom link to someone in their own home, just bear in mind, don't go crazy and invite all your relatives, okay? Thanks so much. And I think Sheila is coming up to organize the door prize. Sorry, home. Oh, yes. So people at home who are watching on the YouTube channel, if you have a birthday close to the date that Sheila's going to give you, then you are welcome to let us know, and I will be watching my phone. Oh, you're going to do it. Okay.
Hi there. So for people that are new, I know there's a couple of people, what we normally have at meetings is a big raffle table. You buy tickets, we make money, and you get a nice prize. But right now, we can't do that. So what we're doing right now is asking our speakers to give us their birth date, and whoever has their birthday on that date or the closest is the prize winner. And it's just a small, full planter. Oh, looks like it might need water. So the birth date, Willoughby's told me his birth date is December 22nd. So if any of you have a birthday on that date or close by, can you let us know? Pardon? December 22nd. So who has the closest birthday to that? Anybody in December? If not, nobody. Anybody at home, Susan? Or, okay, so nobody. Okay, so how about Anybody in November, since that's the next month coming up, or the end of November? Valerie, what date's your birthday? November 9th. Is there anyone closer to December than November 9th? What did you say? But wait a minute. The 19th of November, so that's closer than you, Valerie. So I think you're the prize winner. And what's your name? Trish. And Trish is new, so congratulations.
And that is 1 month from today. It's not today. 1 month from today. Happy almost birthday.
I think that wraps everything up. Normally, we would have had a coffee break and everything, and it would have been a much less sort of rushed affair. But hopefully, the BC Council hopes to have their spring meeting in person, so I hope we can emulate them too coming up. So I will entertain a motion to adjourn this meeting. Okay, Mary moves it. All right, moved and seconded. The meeting is adjourned. And don't forget, it's Zoom in November, you know, not here, Zoom. But do come to the plant sale or plant exchange, plant exchange